I had a splendid voice. In fact, I'd sing in opera if they'd give me my choice. I wrote to Oscar Hammerstein that I would be his star. He said, come down and sing for me, and I'll see how good you are. And I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months. No, I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months. I sang the wise old owl, and he left the room at once. So I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months.
Welcome to the Recluse's Cookbook, Series 3. I'm your host, Vinnie McHale. For anyone returning from the previous seasons, you're very welcome back, and for anyone who is new to the podcast, thanks a million for popping by. Remember, if you enjoy what you hear, then please like and share. My second guest of this series is author and journalist Toby Harnden. Over his career spanning nearly 30 years, Toby has managed to go places where the average member of the public wouldn't dare. As a fledgling journalist in the mid-90s, he went to Northern Ireland to cover the Troubles. In 1999, he published his first book, Bandit Country, the I.R.A. and South Armagh, and it was an instant bestseller that went out of print and then became one of the most sought-after out-of-print books that has ever been published. It has since been republished by Hodder and Staunton in 2022. Over the years, he has followed this amazing publication up with two more factual books, both of which are set during the war in Afghanistan. The first of the books came in 2012 with Dead Man Risen, and then there was 2021's First Casualty. All his books are available to buy on Amazon and all good bookstores. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you Toby Harnden. Can you tell us who you are and what it is that you're best known for to the public?
So my name's Toby Harnden. I guess I'm best known as a journalist, long-time journalist. So I spent nearly 25 years reporting for the Daily Telegraph and then the Sunday Times in UK, Ireland, and then across the world, United States, covering a lot of politics, Middle East. And I've also written 3 books, about to finish up writing the 4th one. And in the UK and Ireland, people remember Bandit Country, but I also wrote a book called Dead Men Risen about a British battle group in Helmand in 2009, and First Casualty about one of the first CIA teams into Afghanistan after 9/11.
So you can you take us a little bit back to your beginning? Were you always destined for a career in journalism and writing, or was there another career beckoning on the horizon and you said
Yeah, well, there was another career. So I was interested in journalism and writing at school. So I grew up in Manchester, in the north of England. But I had the military in my family. So my father was in the Navy, his grandfather was in the Army, sorry, his father was in the Army, and the generation before that was in the Army as well. So I guess a 4th generation military. So I always had this sense. I remember looking at my grandfather's sort of box with his medals and badges and memorabilia from World War II. So I always had a sense of wanting to serve in the military, and that was part of the family tradition. And so when I left school, I joined the Navy as an officer in the Royal Navy, got a sponsorship through university, and I always tended towards English and history. So I studied history at Oxford for my degree. And so writing was always, I think, in me. And years afterwards, actually, I came across a little leaflet, like a career in journalism, that I picked up at school when I was 15 or 16. So I think that was always the way I was likely to go, but I didn't get into it until I was 28. So I did university, and then like 6 years, my sort of return of service for my university sponsorship with the Navy, and then plunged into it after that.
So like it was two different worlds, really, wasn't it? Like you were used to like a very regimental world for a good bit, and then you get tossed into journalism, which is not maybe what some people would consider the most regiment. Maybe keeping deadlines, but in terms of lifestyle, maybe it could be quite keeping different hours.
Yeah, it was less different than you would think, actually, because so in the Navy, I was moving around, um, every 18 months or so, different jobs. I was getting to know all sorts of different people from, you know, ordinary seamen to admirals, just having to get along with people. I served in a ship, HMS Cornwall. We went around the States and the West Indies, 250 people on board. I knew every single one of them, was able to hold a conversation with them, had to get to know them. In a way, every day was different. There was a lot of variety, and I was a junior officer, so you could get away with a lot of stuff. You could have a lot of fun. You could kind of, work the angles. To an extent, you could manage things so you did what you wanted rather than what they wanted. And so the transition to journalism for me was not that stark. Every day was different. You had to get along with people at all sorts of different levels. And the other thing that was interesting is, I guess, in hindsight, I always had a thirst for travel and adventure, and I got a fair amount of that in the Navy, certainly travel, but adventure in terms of you know war zones and experiencing combat as an observer rather than as a participant. I didn't get any of that in the Navy. I mean, I was in this. I joined up after the Falklands. I joined in 1985. I tried very hard to get involved in the Gulf War, but I was stuck on a shore base in Scotland. It was before 9/11. It was the end of the Cold War, so it didn't have this feeling of this is worthwhile. This is existential for the country and any of that sort of stuff that people have had subsequently, and before. And so it felt a little bit self-indulgent sometimes. And and so journalism, I got my fix of going to these places, Northern Ireland, later on Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere, of really being at the sort of sharp end where history was being made, where you know it was a matter of life and death for people living there, and if there were troops involved, for the troops there. So I got that fix that I think I was always, you know, um, searching for in journalism rather than in the military.
I read somewhere, and it's possibly Wikipedia, so it's true or false time, that you started your career um, as a theatre reviewer for the Scotsman reviewing the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. Is that true?
That's true. Well, so I think the first stuff I ever had in print, I used to. This is kind of shows how old I am as well. I used to write letters to newspapers. So when I was a kid, when I was 15 or 16, I wrote letters to the Manchester Evening News about things, and they would get published. And I thought that's cool. You just write something down, and then it's in the newspaper. And uh, later on, I was in the Navy. They never told me I couldn't. Um, I wrote letters, quite a few letters to the Independent, and they got published. I think I thought, yeah, this is, but the Scotsman thing was the first time, and I wrote some obituaries for admirals. So I think before I did this, the Scotsman, I think I wrote one before I did the Scotsman. Then there was somebody from college I knew who worked for the Scotsman. I had a flat in Leith, the port of Edinburgh, and uh, this guy that I knew, Douglas Fraser, he I think he was the arts correspondent at the time, but he had written reviews for the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, the Scotsman. And I thought, that's cool, that looks like fun. And so I spoke to Douglas. He told me this is who I needed to talk to. And I eventually managed to sort of, um, wangle a gig to write for the Scotsman. They had a supplement for the for the Fringe, and I think it was 1990 was the first year that I did. I did it for 3 years, and I can't remember what the pay was, but it was not very much. But it was going to see these performances and writing a 200-word review. This was before internet, so I would go and see the thing. I would write up my review, like type it out on a word processor at home, print it out, get on my bike, cycle into Edinburgh, and deliver it at I think it was Flesh Market Close, which was the entrance, the side entrance to the Scotsman, and then the next day or the day after that, it would be in the newspaper. And then because it was the Fringe, and if you gave somebody a good review and there was a good quote in it, it would sometimes be literally on billboards or would be posters around the city. And so I got this bug of you can write stuff, it can be in print, and then lots of people are going to read it. And actually, that was not a bad bit of training for news journalism, because you had to write, you had to be pretty quick, you had to be flexible, and so yeah, that is what I did.
So how does someone go from reviewing plays and comedy shows at the Edinburgh Fringe Theatre to writing, which is considered to be one of the best books ever written on the Troubles in Northern Ireland?
Well, it's very nice of you to say so. Thank you. Well, you know, in a way, ignorance when you're young is a wonderful thing. So you don't know necessarily how to do things, but I always had this feeling like I'm just going to work it out. I'm just going to find out. So I was in the Navy. You know, I had a good degree in history from Oxford. I knew that I could write. I knew that I was energetic. I knew I was reliable. I knew I had the sort of skills that were needed for journalism. But I didn't really know anybody. There was nobody in the family. There was a couple, you know, as I said, there was a couple of people at college. There was a guy I met backpacking in China who'd become a journalist. And so basically, everybody that I knew who had any connection to it, I just said, how do you get in? How do you do this? And I was based in London at this point. I was working in the Ministry of Defence. I was like bag carrier for an admiral. And I remember there was a guy called Gordon Ducker, Ducker, long dead now. And he was the night news editor for the Daily Express. And he was a reservist in the Air Force. And so he did public relations sort of part-time for the Air Force sometimes. And I remember talking to him at a dinner at Greenwich Naval College in London. And I said, Gordon, how do I break in? I don't really want to go to journalism school if I can help it, because I'm already a bit older than the average, and I just want to get in there. I don't want to. The traditional route is journalism school, City University journalism, or Cardiff. And actually, I did get a place at City University. Then often you will then spend 2 or 3 years on a regional paper. And I was, 26, 27 at this point. I was thinking like, trouble with that is I could be in my 30s before I get a chance on Fleet Street, and that might be too late. And so Gordon said, he was a wise or kind old guy, and he was like, well, if you have no experience, the best way to get in Fleet Street is the diaries. So at the time, there was the Times diary, there was Peterborough, which was the Telegraph diary, the Evening Standard had a diary. And he said, because of, you're in the Navy, there's the Telegraph, and Max Hastings is the editor, and he's very sort of pro-services. He'll be really interested in somebody who's, a naval officer. So why don't you try the Telegraph? And so that's what I did. So I basically found out what Peterborough was, who the editor was. The editor of Peterborough was Quentin Letts, who's still around, writes parliamentary sketches for the Times, the Mail, prolific journalist. And so I wrote, this is a long time ago. I wrote a letter, typed out a letter, sent it to Quentin, and I thought, to sort of persuade him to give me a chance, I said that I would work for nothing, which was a big mistake because Quentin said, why don't you come in and have a chat? And I'm sure you can work for nothing. And so I did work for nothing, but I would get paid if I brought the story in. And so I was moonlighting. I was still in the Navy at this point. I put in my notice to leave. I was going in on like Sundays and Saturdays, or particularly Sunday because that was the Sunday shift for Monday. And there's nothing that will motivate you like being told you'll only get paid if you bring a story in. So I was bringing in stories. I was finding stories and bringing them in because that was the only way I was getting paid. And I was so committed that I was sent to Plymouth for the last few months in the Navy. They sent me down to this sort of non-existent job in Plymouth. So I had to drive like 5 hours to London to go to do this shift for nothing and just get paid by bringing in stories. And so that's what I did. And after a while, I was talking to Quentin and others about, how to properly get in. And somebody said, well, why don't you try and get a trial on news? And so I badgered Quentin and he spoke to Max Hastings. And so I got an interview with Max Hastings for a trial on news. And Quentin had already said to Hastings, he's good, he's enthusiastic, blah, blah, blah. He's not a very good writer. I was like, thanks very much, Quentin. And, it's probably right. I was probably writing in a regimented, writing in the Navy is sort of different. It's regimented, sort of, not very expressive sort of way. But anyway, I managed to get over that. And Hastings gave me a month's trial in the newsroom, which would have been August 1994. And so I had a full month, and I spoke to the naval commander that I was working for down in Plymouth, because this was sort of against the rules. I was moonlighting as a journalist while being in the Navy, and he said to me, he says, "Oh well, he was a nice guy. He was leaving the Navy as well. He was going to become a maths teacher." And he said, "That's good." And he said you probably shouldn't have a byline. You don't want to put your head above the parapet too much. And so I said, okay, sir, right, I won't have a byline. And then as soon as I got into the Telegraph, first of all, they were not expecting me. Nobody had told the news. The news had been told, but she was on holiday, and so basically, I turned up, and I don't know what they thought I was an intern or something, and I sort of bluffed my way a little bit. I had done a few shifts on the Western Morning News in Plymouth, so I sort of implied that I had a little bit more experience than I did. So immediately got put on writing news stories, and they said on day one, well, what's your byline? And so I just said, I'll just use my name. So just on the spot, I decided to jettison my promise to not have a byline. And so I don't know, I worked there for a full month, and sometimes I would get 2 or 3 bylines a day. So I got a whole bunch of news bylines. And sort of on the basis of that, I got eventually, there were a few ups and downs. I was down to 1 shift a week at one point. But eventually I got a sort of short-term contract, and then I was in the newsroom, and that Christmas, the island correspondent was taking his Christmas holiday, and they needed a relief, and so I volunteered to go and be a stand-in for a couple of weeks, and really, really got the bug of the place, and just thought like this is incredible. And this was during the ceasefire, the first I.R.A. ceasefire, and so there's this sense in London that it was all over and it wasn't a big deal anymore. But I felt like this story is not over, and so on the basis of that, I managed to persuade them to let me be the island correspondent when that guy left, and so that's how it happened. So it was not planned out. It was pretty accidental, and I found myself with this job. Now, before I got there, the ceasefire ended. So I was in Docklands when the Docklands in Canary Wharf when the Docklands bomb went off.
Yeah.
And I was worried I was worried that they were going to pull the job from me because they might want somebody more experienced because I had very little experience at that point. And I was conscious that sometimes I would be the last person left in the newsroom when there was a big story because they didn't know that I could sort of do it,
Hmm.
on my own out in the, out on a story because I hadn't had this journalism school, I hadn't had regional newspaper experience. But in the end, I just went and then I was the only person to do it. So those, I guess, those doubts about me, about whether I could be sort of a hard-edged news reporter, just went pretty quickly because the stories were there and I was the only person to do them.
Is it coincidence, irony, or I don't know, kismet that you go to Northern Ireland and your first experience in Northern Ireland is really kind of is at home, say in England, and it's the bomb on the Canary Wharf, and you end up writing probably the book about the Troubles, about the group who planned and planted that bomb.
Well, I think it's all those things. Um, I do think that journalism and news journalism, in a way, is often about answering questions, the questions that ordinary people have. So I always feel like in a news, if it's about a crime or um, a tragedy or whatever it is, you want to, you're the voice, you're the person who is answering the questions that the reader will have. I definitely had a question: where did that big fucking bomb come from, and how did that happen? And uh,
You weren't the only one.
also, right, exactly. And so also in June '96, Manchester was blown up. That's where I grew up. My father and my much younger brother were on the way into city centre when the bomb went off. So it was sort of personal. And I'd also grown up on the story of Robert Nairac,
Okay,
the
yeah.
Grenadier Guardsman who was abducted and killed, body never found, in 1977, and also the Narrow massacre,
Hmm.
the Narrow one
79.
when, yeah, August 79, the same day as Mountbatten was killed in Sligo. I think it was at how many? It was mainly Paris, 19 killed. I think in total at Narrow. So I'd grown up on these stories, and I'd also gone to, I'm Catholic by birth. Um, I'd gone to a school with a lot of um, kids with Irish parents. So I guess all this stuff just fed into my psyche when I went there. But I do, I'm not very religious at all, but I do sometimes think, you asked about how the career kind of unfolded the way it did. It was absolutely not planned. Looking back, there's certain things you think that's logical, um, and there are sort of parallels in you did this and then you did that, and so I do think I was the right person at that time to be there, and for me it was the best time to be there. Um, and pretty early on, I remember I think it would have been June '96. I remember the Garda Jerry McCabe
Yes, yeah, I
had
remember
been
that.
killed in County Kerry with Pierce McCauley and Nessun Quinlimmon, I think were.
Adair, County Limerick, yeah.
Gosh, right. Limerick, that's right, Limerick. So I'd been down south for that, and I was driving across the border, and I did have a bit of a fascination of South Armagh, IRA. I was also aware of the sniper killings, the 50, mostly 50 caliber um, sniper killings. I was aware of Thomas Slab Murphy, the farmer on the border. So I definitely had this sense in my mind of like South Armagh. This is a place of, you know, darkness and mystery. What's that about? I was interested. And as I was driving across the border, which again is an experience at that point, there's big checkpoints and lots of stuff had happened on the border. I saw a sign that said Fork Hill 7. And I knew that Fork Hill was in South Armagh. And at that very day, the news was on the radio that there was a big metropolitan police operation in South Armagh around Forkhill, where it was in connection with the Docklands bomb. So the bomb that I'd been there for,
Mm.
like, less than a mile away from. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll just turn left and see what's happening. And as I drove along, it was a little bit like driving into another world. There were British soldiers in all their camouflage fatigues and stuff, like lying in the bushes and beside the road, and then there were these police officers in like forensic suits. Um, they would take they were covering bits of the bits of like trucks from sort of farmhouses that had been used in the construction of the bomb that went off in Docklands. And so, uh, that day I thought, wow, this is this is crazy. Like there's bombs from England, there's the IRA chief of staff, there's Robert in Iraq, there's um uh, a sniper team or more than one team who are killing British soldiers at very large distances with 50 caliber rifles. Like, where do I read about this? Like, where's the book? And there wasn't a book. So there's all these books about Belfast and Derry and the politics and this and that, but there was no book on South Armagh. And sort of the arrogance of youth in a way. I mean, I was certainly nervous about it, but I was like, okay, well, maybe I should try and write one, and that's how that came about.
So I think it's important to I can't do it as well as what you can, but for to explain to the listeners as to exactly who the South Armagh Brigade of the IRA were slash are, depending on your point of
Yeah,
view.
yeah.
And in terms of the conflict in Northern Ireland, what did they bring to it?
Okay, so that's a great question. That's sort of the question, I guess, that I posed at the beginning of the book, which it's frightening to think about it. But I wrote 26 years ago, but it was sort of republished an updated edition a year ago. That's the question that I sought to answer. So South Armagh was almost entirely Catholic. It was a place where it was rural. It was a place where the IRA had, to an extent, defeated the British and the British security forces, including the then RUC, in that they forced them off the roads. So there were no regular army or RUC vehicles on the roads. So everything happened by helicopter. So they were bringing in trash or bringing out trash or equipment or um, inserting platoons, or if it was just two cops who were being called out to a burglary, they would get in a helicopter, be accompanied by, a platoon of the British Army and drops nearby and walk over. So it was this place that the IRA controlled. Now, obviously, not everybody by any stretch was an IRA supporter, but they had broad popular support. At least Republicans were supported more than the British forces were. So there's a lot of stuff that they could do. It was almost like, it wasn't quite a liberated zone, but it was not that far off. And also there were watchtowers all over the place, which have now been taken down, but have been put up often in places where there've been historic fortifications, because it's been a place of rebellion since, before the Irish border was created. But there were these watchtowers everywhere. But the IRA had learned to operate in dead ground, so because it was a very sort of hilly area, beautiful landscape, but there's a lot of places that could not be seen from watchtowers. So the IRA would, work in that dead ground, move things. They used the border, so obviously different jurisdictions south of the border. So a lot of the weapons caches and the engineering stuff, like the work on devices, like the Docklands bomb was built just south of the border. So So it was kind of a laboratory for the IRA. It was a weapons storage area for the IRA. They were also rural guerrillas, so they'd have very few IRA volunteers killed, relatively few captured in the course of the Troubles, very few informers, so they were not infiltrated like East Tyrone was, or Derry was, or at times Belfast. So um, and and it had carried a lot of weight because it was so successful, and it was so you had senior people in the IRA, so Thomas Slab Murphy, guy who died 2 or 3 years ago, Patrick James O'Callaghan, uh, maybe it's Patrick Joseph. Anyway, PJ O'Callaghan, Patsy O'Callaghan, very senior guy. And there was a guy who's still identified by pseudonym in the book called the Surgeon. These were senior national IRA Republican figures. And that also, as I found out in the course of researching the book, they were running the England department. So these big bombs in Manchester, Docklands, Bishopsgate, Baltic Exchange, those bombs were not just, built in South Armagh, but the whole operation of transporting them, getting them across the Irish Sea, getting them into place. Often the volunteers involved with South Armagh volunteers. So it was just this incredibly militarily important, less so politically, but militarily important place for the Republican movement. It felt like all roads led to South Armagh, and it was the most terrifying posting in the world for a British soldier. A lot of them were killed. I think throughout the Troubles, I think the figure was 123 police and army killed, and sniper at work signs. So it was this sort of incredibly, which had big propaganda, kind of psychological operations sort of value. So it was just this sort of incredibly important, but also mysterious place.
What I really liked about your book, and I loved all of it, but what got me was something that I hadn't. I've read a lot of books on the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and what you got me on from the opening words right through was that first chapter where you talk about the history and the lineage of South Armagh.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, in terms of books about the Troubles or generally books on any kind of conflict, it's one of the best I've ever read. Where was the impetus to come up with that? Because not many people, they'll just write the facts and the figures, whereas you genuinely took an interest in it. Where does that come from?
I don't know. I mean, I've tried to do that with all the books I've done, and it's meant often uh, pretty pretty brutal research process. So I'm currently grappling with this. I'm writing a book about 39 people who've got a particular CIA award. It's over 75 years. Incredible people, incredible stories, and I've written a manuscript. It's 175,000 words, which is probably about 50,000 words too long,
Mhm.
and which means a lot. That means I've spent weeks, sometimes months, on things that don't make it into the book. It's a very kind of brutal process to cut it down, and it's a little bit demoralizing at times because you think this would have been so much more efficient if I just mapped it out beforehand and decided what I was going to do and just done it, and I hadn't gone down all these rabbit holes and off on tangents. But the way the way I work really, and I hope it's been worth it, is that I just immerse myself in subjects and and often in the lives of the people that I'm writing about insofar as I can. And so that means that in some ways I research, you know, 10 books, but it only eventually is one book, which may not be very time efficient, but it does mean that I think by soaking myself in these subjects, it makes for a better book because otherwise it can be pretty shallow. if it's just, and I read books like this and I think, okay, so this person has just repeated all the things, including lots of mistakes that are in newspapers and magazine articles, and they haven't gone below the surface. And so with Bandit Country, which was the first book I did, and I didn't know any other way to do it. And frankly, as a journalist in Northern Ireland, when I got there, I just thought, well, okay, something happens, and I go to it. And so something would happen, and I go there, and then sometimes I find there was no other reporter there because they were just taking it off the news wires or Radio Ulster. But I realized that if I went, it kind of automatically set me apart.
Yeah.
And it would always be worth it. I would always get something both for the article or for the future because I'd meet some cop or army person or local Sinn Féin council or whoever it might be who would be useful and give my reporting depth, um, further down the line. And so with Bandit Country, I just thought, well, listen, I'm a 30-year-old English guy who's been a reporter for a year and I've just turned up. I need to find out what this place is about and what's going on. And so that's what I did. And also, I think the reason I became so interested in the history was also that was a sort of access point in that, the troubles were still on. People were still being killed and stuff. And so it was not without risk. But I worked out early on that if I went to commemorations and historical events and talked to South Armagh Republicans about history, that was relatively benign as a subject. But if I just rocked up and said, "Oh, tell me about the guys who made the Docklands bomb. Tell me about Slab Murphy. Tell me about this volunteer, that volunteer," then it would have been very different. So by immersing myself in the history, I think I managed to occupy a little bit of common ground. I got people to open up a little bit, get to know me, to be able to have conversations, and then I just also realized that things don't happen accidentally. Geography and history is important, and I had a background in history, so I just sort of felt that just like with the current book, I've really immersed myself in the entire history of the CIA, which is 77 years old. And I feel I have to understand that before I can start writing about all the people and get to know what they're about. And then at the same time, before I can write about someone's actions, I need to know what kind of family they have, where they grew up, what their parents were, what they did before they joined the agency. And it was the same with South Armagh. There was kind of nothing I didn't want to know about, and that's how it came together.
Are you like the Daniel Day-Lewis of authors then, are you?
I don't know. He probably earns more money than me.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you come out with a book once every 10, 11 years, and each one's a fucking classic. So it's,
Well, I need to up my hit rate, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. It'd be nice. It'd be nice to do 3 or 4 years. But I had a lot of. Now I'm mostly, I do bits of writing, ghost writing in particular, stuff to pay the bills. But I'm not doing the daily journalism that I used to be doing. But yeah, you had I think Jonathan Trigg on. I know he's written 14 books. I'm like, there is no way I'm going to be able to write 14 books.
You brought me
But I don't know.
You brought me nicely to my next question because Jonathan is a former guest and a friend of the show. And when I booked you for the interview, I says, right, I must get in contact with him and ask him, has he got any questions for you? And the one question that stood out in my mind that he came back with was, what criticism did you receive on account of writing Bandit Country? Despite it being critically acclaimed, there must have been some fierce objection.
Yeah, well, so the setup for it was I had done let's see, 96, 97, 98, 97, 98, 99. So almost 3.5 years as the Telegraph correspondent, and this was intense. This was through Good Friday Agreement, the second IRA ceasefire, all Drum Cree stuff. There was, it was busy as reporting wise. It was very, very busy. I was working for the Telegraph, the establishment British newspaper, with a very unionist editor at the time, Charles Moore, and and so it was a pretty journalistically it was pretty intense. Now, luckily, it was the sort of the start of the internet, so people knew that I'd been in the Navy, and they knew that it was fairly recent. Um, but but I didn't talk about it. I didn't talk about it that much to Republicans. I would talk more about the growing up with Irish kids in Manchester and being, Catholic and stuff. Um, but I think it would be difficult to do now because there's so much more of you that's kind of online. But anyway, they would never, the people of South Armagh, or Irish Republicans, nationalists even, certainly would not have chosen me to tell the story of South Armagh. But on the other hand, I was the only person that was there. I was asking the questions, and so, so they talked to me. But I always thought that I'm just going to get everything I can. I'm going to write the best book that I can, and then I'm going to leave. So I'm not going to pull my punches. I'm not going to say, oh, I'm not going to write about this person or that person, or I'm not. I'm just going to kind of sanitize this incident, because I'm going to need to work with people afterwards and keep contacts, and which is it's understandable, but that's what Northern Ireland journalists had to do, and I think it did lead to a lot of self censorship. So I thought, well, I'm just going to leave it all on the field, as the phrase goes. I'm going to write the thing, and actually, the way the timing worked out, I'd written it, and then I left, and then it was published. So I was never there, apart from visiting, but for their reaction. But I heard some of the reactions. It sold incredibly well. So like, apparently at Newry Eason's, it just was the biggest seller in history. It's like thousands of copies were being sold. And at one point, I was in a back room, like signing them, and they were just being shoveled out to be bought. But they didn't really want me to be out there because I was just this British guy and stuff. So I heard that. I did hear from some of the Republicans that they were really pissed off because I kind of brought them. Some of them, I guess, I brought out of the shadows. One person didn't mind being connected to 25 killings throughout the troubles, but did mind the suggestion that he was a womanizer. So I heard stuff like that, but I also heard a lot of, well, fair play to him. I mean, it portrayed them as a well-trained, well-disciplined, efficient kind of military force. So I think it gave them their due. There was a lot of voices in there of British Army people saying, if this person had been in the British Army, they would have been in the SAS. So I think, and I had emails and contacts from some quite surprising people saying, we really appreciate, I can't say it publicly, but I really appreciate what you did. And so actually, if I'd stayed, I think my contacts and all the rest of it would not really have been damaged by the book. But you'll always get people there'll be some. I hate it when there are mistakes in books, but inevitably, if you're writing 120, 30,000 words, there will be mistakes, or there'll be things that were in documents that don't dovetail with what the participants remember, all that kind of stuff. So, little quibbles here and there from people, but nothing major. I had one of the professors at Oxford that taught me, he criticized it to me for not having like an overall thesis and not basically overlaying the whole story with, I think this is why things happened, this is what should have happened. But I think he misunderstood what I wanted to do. I just wanted to say what happened, fit it
Yeah.
together. I didn't want any emotive language. Like you'll notice, I don't use words like even terrorist or murder
Mm.
unless they're in people's quotes because you, that's what newspapers do and stuff. And but to an extent, it was quote a fair fight, if you like. It was very little sectarian. There was some, but relatively little sectarian stuff in South Armagh over the years, and it was a sort of two armies, a guerrilla army and the British Army and the police, against each other. And you don't need my opinion,
Mm.
and you certainly don't. I was very conscious. I didn't want to use language that is going to alienate 50% of the readership, and people can have the. I just want to say what happened, and you can call it what you want, and you can draw your own conclusions. You don't need them from me, and I think that approach kind of worked in that it was
Yeah.
not a sort of the IRA are thugs, terrorists, murderers, and psychopaths, you know, book, or it wasn't like fighting men of Cross McGlen, with the heirs of the Easter Rising and
Yeah.
and 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 those occupiers. It was just this is what happened, and I think wherever you are on the political spectrum in terms of Ireland, um, it doesn't matter. You could the facts are there and stories of what happened and people's voices, and you can take what you want from it.
Location appears to be a very important theme in your books because your first book was Bandit Country, but you've moved on. You've published two books since, and you got a fourth one coming out. But the next two books are based in Afghanistan: Dead Men Risen and First Casualty. Um, why is that? Is that something that you're aware of? That you seem to have set all three of your published books to date, in very specific locations? Or is that just the way the cards fell?
Well, that's the way the cards fell. The fourth book is not. Well, the fourth book is in many locations, which has been why it's so difficult. Um, but I can't. I find it very hard to write about a place. First of all, until I've been there, and then also as part of the process of the writing, and it's useful. In fact, I feel necessary in the book to have good maps, and I've worked very hard at the maps
Mm.
in my books. But that's how I understand. That's how I understand it. And so with South Armagh, I mean, the map that's in Bandit Country is basically a nicely rendered version of my photocopy of an ordnance survey map that I annotated throughout. I would put where the watchtowers were, where all these different things were, and when there was when I was looking at particular attack, um, so Chief Superintendent Harry Breen and Superintendent um, uh, Bob Buchanan in 1989, I believe. So the two most senior police officers in the Troubles to be killed. And that attack, kind of controversially, was based partly on um, uh, collusion between the IRA and individual Guard officers. I could not. I had documents. I had interviews with people who were connected with the operation and the investigation, but I couldn't understand it until I'd been down there and and literally driven the roads with kind of a stopwatch in my hand. Look at how long did it take to get from Garda Station in Dundalk to the border crossing and Eden Upper Road and so I guess I'm quite visual, and so understanding the history is part of it, but also understanding the topography and the way things are laid out, where the roads go, and how long it takes to drive, and what you can see when you're in this particular place. Like, so you can see where you're in dead ground. Because if you're in a place and you can't see a tower at the time when the towers were there, that's dead ground. That means the IRA can kind of do what it wants in in that area, and um, so that's why I think place became really important, and knowing a place. And maybe, I mean, it's a good point. I hadn't thought about it, that I am drawn to these stories where geography and topography and borders um, are a factor. And I think I don't know, I think that makes it, makes things very interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like in your books the location is it's like in the Scorsese movie, New York is the location, but it's also like the character as well. That's kind of what I take from it when I read your book. Like I remember Bandit Country now is the one I've read, and I've read it repeatedly, and it still plays a massive part in it. Um, Going forward, what was the attraction with Afghanistan? What took you to that particular subject?
Well, I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11.
Okay.
So again, I guess a bit like the Manchester bomb or the Docklands bomb or whatever, it was kind of personal. It's part of my experience. And I think people who were in New York, what in the US or certainly in New York or DC on 9/11 have a different kind of visceral feeling about it than they do if they just saw it on TV in London or Dublin or wherever. And so again, I hadn't thought about it like this really, but um, a bit like the Docklands bomb, and okay, where did that come from? Who did that and how did it come about? I had that feeling as well with 9/11. I was very frustrated at the time because the Telegraph wouldn't send me to Afghanistan. So they were like, no, you're covering the Bush administration, you're doing a good job, you've got the contacts, you need to stay there. And so I was watching the invasion and the Green Berets on horseback, and the fall of the Taliban from Washington. And then same thing with Iraq. I remember almost having my head in my hands when the statue of Saddam came down. Bear in mind, I've been through, you know, 10 years in the Navy and not seen any action. And now I felt like I'd missed two wars. Now, of course, those wars went on for, for, for 20 years. But I mean, but 9/11 and the wars afterwards were part of my journalistic generation. They're the big stories. And so um, most most journalists ended up going there in 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 some way or at some point. And I was itching to get there, and it took a little while, but so I first went to Iraq in after the invasion. So I first went in like the autumn of 2003, and then Afghanistan I went to first very end of 2005, start of 2006, before the British went into Helmand. In fact, that's what I was writing about the first time I went there. Um, but Afghanistan is an incredible place. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the people. I mean, it's really beguiling. And there was a sort of a previous generation of journalists who covered the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, and a lot of those people, they just kind of fell in love with the place and were captivated by the story. And so I think for me, I mean, I was never based in Afghanistan. I spent sort of extended periods there. I'd like to have been, um, but it's just a place that you can't. There just takes hold of you, and it's hard to shrug off in the way that some other places are. So Iraq, for instance, it's a much sort of harsher place. The people are much more sort of beaten down, and I mean, Afghanistan, there's sort of this color and humor and sort of almost theatrics in a way that you don't get in many other places.
It's like
Alongside this
it's like a
carnage and
it's kind of like a warmer, dustier South Armagh, then, is it?
well, I sort of hesitate on the parallels and stuff because the British, with a fair amount of arrogance, I think, went into these conflicts and were like, oh, we know what to do here because we've been in Northern Ireland, and you patrol with your berets on and you do hearts and minds, and and there's a really big difference between Al Qaeda and the IRA, no matter what some people might want to say, oh, they're all terrorists. And I think in terms uh, of it took the British sort of 25 years or so to get to grips with the IRA. And even though they were essentially speaking the same language, didn't want to get imprisoned, didn't want to die, um, and 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 in terms of family and aspirations and what they wanted out of life, there's a pretty big crossover between your IRA volunteer and your average working class British person, and that is not the case with people who are in Al Qaeda or ISIS, what have you. So I do hesitate to draw the parallels. But having said that, I mean, there are a lot of reporters, they cut their teeth in Northern Ireland and then went out to the Middle East and covered conflicts elsewhere. And I think it is a good training ground, and it really it does help you understand, the psyche of guerrilla warfare and whatever you want to call it, asymmetric warfare, and with South Armagh, you know, the advantages that the indigenous people have in terms of knowing the pattern of life and knowing the topography and coming from a sort of farming background. Those are all things. The support of the people. Those are all things that the IRA had in South Armagh, and in different ways and to different degrees, the Taliban had in, say, Helmand province. So, yeah, I mean, there were similarities. I mean, one of the beauties, I hesitate to use the word, but about covering Northern Ireland is it's so small, as is, Israel and the Palestinian territories. So because I was based in Israel for a while, and what that means is that you can, as I said, in Northern Ireland, if something went bang or somebody was shot, I would go there. It was all, maximum a couple of hours drive, and I would always go. And the same in Israel, you could always go. It's difficult to get around sometimes, but it's a very small sort of patch of land. Now, Afghanistan is much bigger, but I think having had that experience of a smaller conflict and going to these places um, and kind of soaking myself in what was happening and why it was happening and the history and the topography and everything, I think was extremely useful for Afghanistan. I mean, a lot better than, I don't know, covering council meetings in, Basildon or whatever some of the other alternatives would have been, or covering pure politics. So I mean, I've written a lot about politics. I kind of hate it now. I realize in hindsight, I kind of hate covering politics, and I mostly hate politicians. Um, but but I sort of mostly hate politicians, and I hate most of them. I guess is something that I sort of now realize, and also the people in politics. And so I think that's not that's not really a great background to go and cover war and conflict and its effect on ordinary people and the sort of ordinary people, who were involved in the fighting as well, because politics is so removed from regular people and ordinary life. So, also the Navy was a pretty good background. That was a pretty good experience. I mean, it's hard to separate these things. I always just feel that when I'm writing a book or tackling a subject, all the things, my upbringing, my time in the Navy, time in Northern Ireland, wherever it all comes together, and that's who I am at that moment, and where each individual bit came from is sometimes hard to tell.
So, where to next for Toby Harnden?
Well, I'm going to be 60 in January, so which is like, how did that happen? It's kind of an incredible feeling. So, I just want to keep So I'm pretty much done, I think, with regular news reporting, being out on the road. Journalism has changed a lot, and in many ways, not for the better. And I now have nostalgia about the way things were in the sort of mid 90s and pre-internet and stuff. And I'm glad that I, you know, sort of grew up in that time. Having said that, it's incredible. Some of the tools we have on the internet, in the incredible amount of material and archives, and some of the tools like AI transcription. I used to spend hours and hours and hours transcribing interviews, and now I can just pop it into Otter, and then there's a 95% accurate transcript that comes out, which saves a massive amount of time for me and means I can spend a lot more time doing interviews. So there's incredible, you know, benefits and advantages of the sort of digital era that I feel like I'm now well placed to use because I used to be able to do it without that. But I just want to keep write more books. I do want to write at a pace that's a bit quicker than one every decade. But I just want to tell great stories and and get to know people and help improve people's lives by putting their stories together. So the people I write about are quite important, I think, because I want the people I interview and the people who were involved in the events I write about, I want to help them make sense of it. And sometimes even people who write at the heart of things don't really understand it because there was so much going on right in front of them that they have a sort of tunnel vision, whereas I can sort of put it together and just to tell stories for posterity. So something like Bandit Country, for instance, I do feel very proud of it because I feel that, long after I've gone, that book will still be there and people will still get something from it. I kind of understand that. And although sometimes there are books where you sort of think, particularly if it's a biography or something, you think, well, that book was there to be written. Like, and it just was that person who went and wrote it. But if he or she hadn't have written it, somebody else would have done. But what I feel about the books that I've done is if I hadn't written them, they wouldn't exist. I mean, somebody probably would have done a book about South Armagh, maybe, but it would have been a totally different book. So I kind of created something, or it's kind of creation, excavation, making sense of stuff and putting it there, but it's something that wouldn't exist if I wasn't there. So I guess I want to keep doing that to to contribute something to the sum of human knowledge that will be valuable to people. It doesn't have to be millions of people, even if it's a few dozen people or something. But that to me is what I want to do, and that's what I find valuable. And the money and all the rest of it, I just want to have enough to be able to keep doing it.
That concludes my interview with Toby Harnden. Please see all links relating to Toby and his work down below and check them out. You will not be disappointed. We'll be back in a fortnight with our next guest. Until then, please like and share where and when you can. You've been listening to the Recluse's Cookbook. Until next time.